All right. This is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 12, Section 2, African Americans in the Antebellum United States. So for the most part, we're just going to be using 1860 as a reference here. That is the year right before the Civil War. And in the year 1860, there were approximately 4 million African American or Black American slaves in the South. There was also approximately 500,000 free blacks living in the United States. Of those, we'll say around 280,000 free blacks in the South, and about 220,000 there. Free blacks in the North, right? And one of the significant changes during the antebellum period that we mentioned last time was the cotton boom, or the transition to cotton. So really life, or in this case, we'll talk first about the enslaved African population. Life changed as a result of cotton. Some things remained the same. So, for example, ideas regarding paternalism didn't really change. Paternalism was the idea of slaveholders, so these are white slaveholders, that they, quote unquote, took care of their slaves. And this was used to justify slavery. It was also used to mask or hide the violent reality. And the violent reality, or the reality of slavery, and again, we want to highlight violence as really the linchpin here, keeping it all together, was both psychological and physical. Physical, you can see pretty explicitly here. Whipping, punishment, also what looks like, sort of medieval devices that were used to punish slaves physically. But I want to highlight this point, psychological, because this ties back to the cotton boom. And in many ways, the cotton boom was, a disaster for slaves in the United States. Because of the shift from slavery, we'll talk about this a little bit more, from the upper South to the lower South, that many slaves were sold from Virginia and Maryland to places like Texas, Arkansas, etc., etc. And we might say one of the worst psychological aspects to cotton slavery in particular was the uneasiness that certain family members could be sold, that husbands and wives were separated, that children were separated from their families. In some cases, it was used by slaveholders in order to punish their own enslaved people. So we might say worst psychological aspect to cotton slavery was the breakup of families, right? And cotton really did that. Whereas before, you might have had 3 or 4 generations of slaves in a place like Virginia or Maryland, families that were, for the most part, kept together, generally speaking. But with the cotton boom then and the demand for slaves in the South, families were ripped apart again, children being ripped away from their mothers, husbands and wives being separated, and the fact that it could also be used as a weapon by slaveholders against their enslaved populations. And so in response, slaves, resisted at every opportunity they had. One of the most common forms of resistance was sabotage. Sabotage is to what's a good way to describe sabotage? Intentionally force the plantation to lose profit. This was usually done in a way that didn't result in any sort of violent backlash. It could be pretty much blamed on neglect. Slaves often, quote unquote, accidentally broke their tools in order to sabotage the plantation. Other forms of resistance were used. There was a smaller degree of violent uprisings. We'll talk about why that is in the case, but something like the daily sabotage was a concurrent basis. For slaves in the United States, despite it being illegal, many slaves did marry. Husbands had wives, wives had husbands. They did have families. Again, we might just want to say the threat of being broken or being split up was constantly there, and probably one of the worst psychological aspects. But also within these families, traditional African beliefs did persevere. For the most part, many slaves did convert to Christianity, willingly and unwillingly. But there was also many other African traditions that survived. So, for example, Christianity is a religion that is mostly concerned with things like right and wrong, moral and immoral, how one gets to heaven. It's not very applicable in sort of a physical or real world sense. So, for example, African traditions that had to do with things like healing sickness, or wanting to get good, a good harvest or something like that, were much more applicable. So these two survived together in many ways. Now, again, what I mentioned earlier, most African Americans in the United States in the Antebellum period, most blacks in the U.S. were enslaved in the South, but there was at least a degree of free blacks that's worth mentioning here. Most of the free black population lived in the Upper South. Again, Upper South refers to Virginia and Maryland. There, it was largely a result of manumission. Recall, manumission was when slaveholders released their slaves. This was done both for economic and maybe moral or principled reasons. The spirit of the American Revolution led to some manumissions. Christianity led to some manumissions, but also the fact that tobacco was declining as a commodity, and slaves were no longer needed economically speaking. So most of the free black population, or at least a considerable part of it, came from manumission. However, even within the free black population, discrimination or how society perceived one did depend on the degree of skin color. For those who could, quote unquote, pass as white, they found things much easier than those who couldn't due to their skin color. And even though the free black population was not enslaved, there were plenty of discriminatory laws that did not make them equal to their white counterparts. So these were specific laws that only applied to blacks and not whites. So for example, being able to serve on juries or testify against whites, certain employment or property laws, and these were largely based on a state-by-state basis. Additional conditions to vote, for example, is also a good example, another good example of that. So like we mentioned before, in terms of violent uprisings, less common than you find throughout the Atlantic world. There is more reasons. There's a couple of reasons for that. Mainly for slaves, there were just better and more effective alternatives. Recall that the enslaved population in the United States, one, does not outnumber the free white population. That's different than pretty much any other slave society in the South. That most slaves in the United States are more spread out. The difference between a place like Jamaica or Haiti as compared to like Texas or Georgia. And the fact that most enslaved people in the United States have families. There's a general balance between the number of enslaved men and enslaved women, Whereas if you look at sugar plantations in the Caribbean, it's mostly young men aged 22 years old with a life expectancy of, maybe 3 years if they're lucky. So there's different conditions. There tends to be a lot more violent slave revolts in the Caribbean. The Haitian Revolution is a perfect example of that. But the bottom line was that, slave revolts, there were better alternatives, namely in the United States, running away. The fact that the United States was so large, one could run away, essentially having a better chance at survival, deal the amount of economic damage to the slaveholder, and stand a better chance of surviving. That's not to say that slave revolts did not happen in the United States. We have two examples here. A revolt that took place in New Orleans in 1811, probably the largest number of slaves who revolted in this case, approximately 500. But like most violent revolts did fail, and most of those who participated in it were punished by being, executed. And even those who were not involved in it could be punished by being executed or at least banished from certain territories. By far the most notorious slave uprising was that of Nat Turner in 1831. This took place in Virginia. Nat Turner, who was inspired by Christianity, very much saw the world in terms of black and white, good and evil, had visions about the end of times, that, black angels would battle white angels in the sky. And this was sort of the cause that Nat Turner took up. And it was incredibly violent. Nat Turner and his followers went on a spree of violence, killing essentially everyone in his path. And although Nat Turner and his followers were eventually caught by the militia and executed subsequently, things like Nat Turner's revolt, especially this one in 1831, fed into fears of slave revolts. And this is really kind of the impact that violent slave revolts have in the United States, is that the reality is that revolts, we might say revolts, were not as common, right? As common versus the fear, which was very much real, right? So there was a much larger fear or anxiety about violent slave uprisings than there were, sort of actual revolts that took place. Again, better alternatives existed for enslaved peoples running away, namely. And this leads to, changes in things like laws. So, for example, in the aftermath of Nat Turner's revolt, whereas before slaves were encouraged to learn Christianity, afterwards it's discouraged in certain areas, banning slaves from being preachers or ministers, or prohibiting the congregation of too many enslaved people in one particular area. Lastly, we can talk about the domestic slave trade, the slave markets, like we'd mentioned in the section before. The transatlantic slave trade was banned in 1808. No more slaves could legally be imported to the United States. However, we did mention that there was some degree of smuggling that took place. This term is going to be a good term to know, the second middle passage. This has to do with the domestic slave trade, slaves from the upper South to the lower South. The second middle passage will say the name for the slave trade, or name for the, I guess it's not technically a voyage if it's not by sea. Some of it was by sea, but we'll say the name for the trip that slaves took when being sold from upper South to lower South. All right, so if you recall the first middle passage, that was described from the trip from Africa to the New World across the Atlantic Ocean, hellish conditions, 25% death rate. The second middle passage explains simply the shift, the largest forced migration in U.S. history, from the upper South down to the lower South and further to the west. New Orleans was the largest slave market in the United States. There were other areas. There's an illustration provided by your text. And, due to the ban on the transatlantic slave trade. And due to the fact that cotton was considered white gold, it was simply so profitable, the demand for slaves increased dramatically during this period. And when demand increases, so does the price as it increases. So, pretty much more slaves were needed in order to continue funding the harvesting and exporting of cotton in the American South.